In 2008, in the quiet suburbs of Atlanta, Georgia, a toxic marriage led to a scandalous affair and a tragic ending. This is the story of Emily Thompson, a woman whose broken marriage drove her into the arms of another man, only for it to end in murder. Emily's affair not only resulted in pregnancy, but also spiraled into a deadly confrontation that stunned the community and destroyed lives. Emily Thompson had once been a woman filled with dreams and hope. 10 years earlier, when she married Oliver Thompson, she envisioned a life of love and happiness, much like any young bride would. Oliver, a successful real estate agent, had seemed perfect at the time, ambitious, charming, and confident. He offered Emily a world of security, promising her the comfortable life they were building in the quiet suburbs of Atlanta, Georgia. But beneath that picture-perfect exterior, their marriage slowly decayed into something far darker. By the time they reached their 10th year together, the love Emily once felt for Oliver had been chipped away, piece by piece. Oliver's charm had faded, revealing a man who was emotionally cold and distant. His real estate business consumed most of his time, and when he was home, he treated Emily more like a business arrangement than a wife. Emily became a full-time homemaker, a role that suffocated her as Oliver's controlling behavior grew. He had always been the type of man who liked everything in its place: his house, his business, and even his marriage. To him, Emily was just another part of that life to manage. Behind the doors of their suburban home, Emily's spirit was slowly breaking. The couple barely spoke to each other anymore, existing like ghosts in the same house. Oliver spent long hours at work or in meetings, leaving Emily alone with her thoughts. Days blurred together as she took care of the house, feeling as though she had lost herself in the routine of a loveless life. She missed the days when Oliver would look at her with affection, missed the times when they would talk for hours about their future. But those days were gone, and now she was just a shadow of the woman she once was. By 2012, Emily had emotionally checked out of the marriage. She knew things wouldn't change with Oliver, but she felt trapped. Divorce seemed impossible. Oliver had threatened once before that if she ever left him, he would ruin her financially and take everything they built together. So Emily stayed, a prisoner of her circumstances, silently enduring the emotional neglect. Then came Richard Clark, a 30-year-old contractor hired to work on renovations at the Thompsons' house. He was everything Oliver wasn't: kind, attentive, and genuinely interested in Emily. Richard had a rugged charm about him, the kind of man who was comfortable in his own skin. He was good at his job, too, meticulously restoring the old parts of their house while making friendly conversation with Emily. At first, their interactions were innocent, just polite exchanges about the work being done. But there was something about Richard that Emily couldn't ignore. As the renovations continued, Richard and Emily spent more time together. He would compliment her on small things: her taste in decor, her cooking when she offered him coffee, and slowly, those compliments began to fill the emotional void Oliver had left behind. Richard made her feel seen, something she hadn't felt in years. Over time, their conversations shifted from casual topics to more personal ones. Richard shared stories about his own life, his work, his childhood, his failed relationships, and Emily found herself opening up in ways she hadn't with anyone in a long time. It wasn't long before Emily found herself drawn to Richard in ways she didn't expect. She would look forward to his visits, finding excuses to spend more time around him as he worked. What started as harmless attraction soon evolved into something far deeper. Emily's feelings for Richard grew, and before she knew it, they had fallen into a passionate affair. Their stolen moments were filled with intensity and excitement, a sharp contrast to the dull, lifeless marriage she had with Oliver. For the first time in years, Emily felt alive again. Richard's affection revived a part of her that had been dormant for so long. The affair lasted for several months. Emily would sneak around behind Oliver's back, meeting Richard in secret while Oliver was away at work. It felt dangerous, exhilarating. She knew it was wrong, but after years of being starved for love and affection, she didn't care. Richard was everything she had been missing. And for a while, it seemed like this secret world they had created could last forever. But by early 2013, the fantasy came crashing down. Emily began to feel unwell, and, after missing several periods, she'd feared the worst. She was pregnant. At first she was in denial, telling herself it couldn't be true. But as the signs became undeniable, reality set in, and Emily's world began to unravel. She was unsure whether the baby was Oliver's or Richard's, but deep down, she suspected the truth. The baby was Richard's. And the life she had built, the secret she had kept, was on the verge of being exposed. When Emily told Richard about the pregnancy, hoping he would support her, his reaction was not what she expected. He was shocked, his face turning pale as he tried to process the news. Emily could see the fear in his eyes. He didn't want a child, not with her, not in the middle of their complicated affair. Richard wasn't ready for that kind of responsibility, especially knowing that the baby could blow their secret wide open. In his mind, the affair was supposed to be fun, a temporary escape. But a pregnancy? That was something neither of them had prepared for. The conversation that followed was heated, full of accusations and desperation. Emily pleaded with Richard to stand by her, but he refused. He made it clear that he wanted nothing to do with her anymore, and certainly nothing to do with the baby. He saw the pregnancy as the end of their affair, and with that, he walked out of her life, leaving Emily devastated and alone once again. Now, Emily was truly trapped. The affair had ended in disaster, and she was left to face the consequences on her own. The man she had fallen in love with had abandoned her, and the husband she had tried to escape from would never forgive her if he found out the truth. Emily's once orderly life was in shambles, and there was no one left to save her. She would have to confront her new reality alone, with a child whose very existence threatened to destroy everything she had ever known. By the early months of 2013, the cracks in Emily and Oliver's marriage had grown deeper. Oliver, a man known for his meticulous control over every aspect of his life, began to notice subtle changes in Emily's behavior. She had grown more distant, avoiding conversations with him and spending more time out of the house. Her once calm demeanor had shifted. She was moody, restless, and increasingly secretive. It was a sharp contrast to the woman Oliver had known, someone who had always been predictable, always reliable. Now she was slipping through his fingers, and Oliver's suspicions began to grow. For Oliver, the thought of losing control was unbearable. He had always prided himself on having a well-ordered life. His real estate business was thriving, and he enjoyed the prestige and security that came with it. He believed he had everything under control, including his wife. But now, Emily's strange behavior left him feeling unsettled. He had never been one to tolerate betrayal, and deep down, he sensed something was terribly wrong. In February 2013, Oliver made the decision to hire a private investigator. He needed to know the truth, and he was not the type of man to confront Emily without proof. The investigator worked quietly, following Emily over the course of several weeks. It wasn't long before Oliver got the confirmation he had dreaded. Emily was having an affair with Richard Clark, the contractor who had worked on their home. The investigator provided Oliver with photos, text messages, and detailed reports. The evidence was undeniable. Emily had been sneaking around behind his back, betraying him with another man. The discovery enraged Oliver, but he didn't react immediately. He was a man who believed in keeping his emotions tightly controlled. Instead of confronting Emily, he withdrew into himself, creating an icy atmosphere in the house. He stopped speaking to her, his cold silence filling every corner of their once shared home. For weeks, Emily tried to reach out to him, but he shut her out completely. He refused to give her the confrontation she perhaps expected. Instead, Oliver plotted a more calculated response. He wanted to make her feel the weight of her betrayal. His anger simmered beneath the surface, but outwardly, he was calm, waiting for the right moment to unleash his plan. By March 2013, Emily, unaware of the extent of Oliver's knowledge, grew increasingly desperate. She sensed his coldness, the distance between them that seemed to widen with each passing day. It terrified her. The affair with Richard had crumbled after the pregnancy, leaving her feeling isolated and ashamed. She realized that she needed to salvage what was left of her life, even if it meant confessing everything. She believed that maybe, just maybe, Oliver would forgive her if she came clean. In a moment of vulnerability, Emily sat down with Oliver and confessed her affair. She laid it all out, telling him about her emotional detachment, the affair with Richard, and even the pregnancy. She hoped that by being honest, they could find a way forward, maybe even rekindle their marriage. But Oliver's reaction was far colder than she had anticipated. Now, armed with the full knowledge of her betrayal, Oliver rejected her entirely. He didn't explode in anger or shout. Instead, he calmly informed her that their marriage was over. He threatened to divorce her and take everything, leaving Emily with nothing. The coldness in his eyes was devastating. Emily's last hope of saving her marriage was shattered in that moment, and she was left with nothing but the harsh reality of her situation. As spring turned into summer, Emily's life spiraled out of control. She was trapped in a marriage that was essentially over, carrying a child she wasn't sure she could raise alone, and the man she had turned to for comfort, Richard, had abandoned her. Her desperation grew by the day, and the walls seemed to close in around her. Oliver's rejection had left her feeling like she was drowning, with no one to turn to. She knew that if Oliver went through with his threats, she would lose everything: her home, her security, and possibly even her child. The weight of it all was suffocating. By June 2013, Emily reached her breaking point. The fear of raising a child alone and losing everything in a divorce consumed her. One night, driven by a combination of rage and despair, Emily decided to confront Richard. She couldn't bear the thought of him walking away from the situation, while she was left to deal with the consequences. On the night of June 22nd, she made the fateful decision to drive to Richard's apartment. The atmosphere in the car was thick with tension as Emily drove through the humid summer night. The air was heavy, much like her thoughts, swirling with anger and desperation. She couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal, both from Richard and Oliver. When she arrived at Richard's apartment, her hands trembled as she knocked on the door. The moment Richard opened it, the tension between them was palpable. Emily could see the reluctance in his eyes, the cold indifference that had replaced the affection they once shared. Inside the apartment, the conversation quickly turned heated. Emily pleaded with Richard, begging him to take responsibility for the baby. But Richard, still unwilling to face the consequences of their affair, refused. He made it clear that he wanted no part in her life or the child's. His words cut through Emily like a knife, the final blow to her already shattered sense of hope. The argument escalated quickly. Emily's emotions, already teetering on the edge, exploded into a fury she couldn't control. In a moment of blind rage, she reached for the kitchen knife that lay on the counter. Without thinking, without fully comprehending what she was about to do, she stabbed Richard multiple times. The force of her anger translated into each thrust of the blade, and before she realized what had happened, Richard lay lifeless on the floor, blood pooling around his body. The room fell silent, the only sound being Emily's ragged breathing. Her mind was racing, but everything around her felt eerily still. She dropped the knife, her hands shaking as she looked down at the scene before her. Panic set in, but it was too late. The man she had once loved was dead, and there was no undoing what had been done. Emily fled the apartment, her heart pounding in her chest as she sped away into the night. She left Richard's body behind, bleeding out on the cold floor of his apartment. The reality of what she had done hadn't fully hit her yet, but in the back of her mind, she knew her life would never be the same again. The desperation, the betrayal, the anger, it had all culminated in a single tragic act. Now, there was no turning back. On the morning of June 23, 2013, the quiet routine of Richard Clark's apartment complex was shattered by a disturbing discovery. A neighbor, who had heard a loud argument the night before, became concerned when she noticed Richard's apartment door slightly ajar. The complex was typically peaceful, and Richard had always been polite and quiet, so the neighbor found the situation unusual. Approaching cautiously, she peered inside, calling out his name, but no response came. As she stepped further into the apartment, her heart sank. There, on the floor of the living room, was Richard's lifeless body. The scene was gruesome. Blood had pooled beneath him, and it was clear that he had been stabbed multiple times. Panic seized the neighbor as she backed out of the apartment and immediately called 911. The police arrived shortly after, cordoning off the area and launching an investigation into what appeared to be a brutal, violent crime. Detectives began combing through the apartment, looking for any clues that could explain what had happened. It was clear from the beginning that this wasn't a random act of violence. The nature of the wounds and the scene suggested something far more personal. As investigators surveyed the evidence, they were able to piece together the timeline of Richard's final hours. His phone was found near his body, and a quick examination revealed heated text exchanges between him and Emily Thompson on the night of his murder. The messages were emotional and intense, showing a clear argument between the two. As the investigation progressed, neighbors were questioned. Several of them recalled hearing raised voices coming from Richard's apartment the night before, though most dismissed it as a typical argument. However, one neighbor reported something that caught the detectives' attention. They had seen a car parked near the apartment complex that matched the description of Emily's vehicle. This was enough to put Emily on the police's radar. On June the 28th, Emily was brought in for questioning. At first, she played the part of the grieving lover, devastated by the news of Richard's death. She acted shocked, even tearful, as she recounted how she had heard about his murder. She insisted that she had no idea who could have done such a thing, but the detectives weren't convinced. They had too much evidence pointing in her direction: the phone records, the witnesses, the argument. The more they pressed her, the more her story began to crack. At first, Emily denied everything. She claimed that she hadn't seen Richard in days and had no reason to visit him on the night he was killed. But the pressure from the investigation was mounting, and as the detectives continued to confront her with the evidence, Emily's composure began to crumble. The weight of her guilt seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. And by July 2nd, after nearly a week of intense questioning, Emily finally broke. She confessed to the murder, her voice shaking as she explained how the confrontation with Richard had spiraled out of control. Emily told the detectives how she had gone to Richard's apartment that night, desperate for answers. She wanted him to take responsibility for the baby, to acknowledge what they had done, and to stand by her. But Richard had refused, coldly rejecting her pleas. Emily said she had been overwhelmed with emotion, acting out of desperation and fear. She hadn't intended to kill him, but in that moment of rage, she had grabbed the knife and lost control. It was a crime of passion, she insisted, driven by the intensity of her feelings and the hopelessness of her situation. The confession, while shedding light on what had happened that night, also revealed the deep emotional turmoil Emily had been facing. The affair, the pregnancy, and the collapse of her marriage had pushed her to the brink. But now, the reality of what she had done was inescapable. Richard was dead, and there was no undoing the damage. The investigation quickly moved forward, and by the end of 2013, Emily's case was prepared for trial. The media picked up the story almost immediately, and it became a sensation. Tabloids splashed Emily's face across their front pages, digging into the details of her toxic marriage with Oliver, the affair with Richard, and the pregnancy that had ultimately led to murder. The story captivated the public, who were fascinated by the scandalous mix of betrayal, desperation, and violence. The trial began in February 2014, drawing crowds of reporters and curious onlookers who filled the courtroom. Emily, looking worn and much older than her 35 years, sat quietly as the prosecution laid out their case. They painted her as a scorned lover who had committed cold-blooded murder. The prosecution emphasized the toxic nature of her relationship with Oliver, how she had turned to Richard for comfort, only to kill him when things didn't go her way. They argued that Emily had planned the murder, knowing that her affair and pregnancy would destroy her life if it became public knowledge. The defense, however, took a different approach. They portrayed Emily as a woman who had been emotionally abused for years by Oliver, driven to the edge by his manipulation and control. They argued that she had acted out of fear and desperation, not premeditation. The defense emphasized that Emily had never intended for things to escalate to murder, but rather that the situation had spiraled out of control in a moment of emotional turmoil. As the trial dragged on, the courtroom became a battleground of narratives. The prosecution and defense painted two very different pictures of Emily. On one side, she was a calculating killer, driven by selfish motives. On the other, she was a victim of circumstance, a woman pushed beyond her limits by the emotional abuse she had endured. The public, too, was divided. Some sympathized with her, seeing her as a broken woman who had been driven to do the unthinkable. Others saw her as a cold-blooded murderer who had chosen to end Richard's life rather than face the consequences of her affair. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated. On March 15, 2014, they returned with a verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. The decision was met with mixed reactions. Some saw it as justice for Richard, while others felt pity for Emily, who would now face the consequences of her actions. Emily was sentenced to 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole, leaving behind a life shattered by betrayal, rage, and a moment of uncontrollable emotion. Emily's story became a tragic tale of love, betrayal, and murder. Her once picture-perfect life in suburban Atlanta was destroyed by her toxic marriage and the desperate choices she made. Oliver filed for divorce soon after the trial and moved out of the state. Emily, now serving her sentence, will one day be released, but the stain of her crime will follow her forever. The child, born while Emily was in prison, was put up for adoption, leaving a final chapter of heartbreak in a story that shocked the quiet suburbs of Atlanta. This just reminds me of the story where a wife takes revenge on her cheating husband while she was in chemo. Kindly like and subscribe and watch this next video.